So if I briefly go through some of James Churchward's theories that come from the motherland of man, the lost continent of Mu, motherland of men. One thing is we have the lost continent of Mu here in the Pacific. It doesn't cover the entire. James said that this continent sunk 12 to 14,000 years ago, and he wasn't exactly sure of where the entire outline was, but he was sure it was close. And if you notice, there is Atlantis over here in the Atlantic Ocean. Another part of his theories, came from a headline out of his scrapbooks, that there were 64 million white people on Mu when it was wiped out. He also located Eden, the lost Garden of Eden in Mu. He said that Ezra mistranslated the Nakal tablets. Moses knew the proper translation, that they did come from the Nakal Brotherhood of the continent of Mu. Unfortunately, they were mistranslated, and the Garden of Eden was placed in the Levant, in the Middle East. He also said that the people of Mu populated our planet. As you can tell, he shows lines of immigration and migration. Another point was the Great Uyghur Empire. He called it the primary colony of Mu. This is, if it's hard to see, this is Asia, and you can see just the end of Mu right here. Now, James Churchward's influence. On Wikipedia, you can come across an ever-increasing list of computer games and books that are available that reference James, that use him as inspiration. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the father of the modern Turkish nation, he read it, researched it, and was very interested in what James had to say. And that interest even includes today, where they're still coming out with books today. In the 1970s, some of you may remember Led Zeppelin 4. These symbols right here were inspired by the re-release of the Sacred Symbols of Mu. And even into the 1990s, they did another one, another album, not Led Zeppelin, but the KLF did an album and came out with the song Bound for Moo Land. But all of this is, all James' influences are not just fun and games. For instance, Vertice Gostin calls herself the Empress of Mu, and she claims U.S. sovereignty over the United States. She uses James' writing as proof, and she sells citizenship in her empire, and you don't have to pay income taxes. Wesley Stipes found out about that. James wrote something different. He said that all people came from Mu, and that everybody was equal. There was no higher race. Another influence is D.M. Murdoch, also known as Acharya S., who uses James' writing to prove that Jesus didn't exist. Now, James would have rolled over in his grave. I am absolutely sure of that. And I did a podcast in November of 2007 to state that James would not have agreed with that. Well, after 6 months, they must have found it, because then it was removed from YouTube as hate speech. And they started in with the emails, and I can't quote any of those emails, and I won't. But I did get it back out there. They can't take it down now. But I believe that respect for beliefs, for different beliefs, is a prerequisite or a cornerstone for people being tolerant. Another influence is, under the banner of the Great Uyghur Empire, the Polatkaya says that everyone speaks Turkish. He says that the original high civilization was Turkish, and that right now everybody has taken words from the Turkish, rearranged the letters, and now we're actually speaking Turkish, but we don't know it. But that's what he says. Kazim Mirsan, who is Uyghur from Gulja city, he disputes the fact of the dating of the Great Uyghur Empire. Now, there is a historical Great Uyghur Empire from the 8th and 9th century in Central Asia. We know it's the 8th and 9th century. There's documents written about it. Unfortunately, he wants to say it's 16,000 years old and just completely ignores any records to the contrary. And I wanted to mention about the pyramids in China. These pyramids are near Qian, China. This was the, the capital of both the Tang and the Han dynasty. And the people buried their emperors in enormous, that looks like pyramids, but actually they're flat-topped, so not really pyramids. But these are well documented. The people around there have always known that Han and Tang dynasty emperors were born there. Unfortunately, some of the proponents of this theory believe that the Chinese people are just lying because they're Uyghurs and they should be Uyghurs and not Chinese. And I'm not going to call the Chinese people liars if they have records that show that. So, is James relevant today? Well, there's books and articles still being written. I know that 2 ebooks will be released this summer that are from James' pen. I am aware of a complete book that has never seen the light of day. I was lucky enough to see some scans that someone sent to me. And then while I was writing this PowerPoint presentation, there came out an announcement of somebody else who is also releasing a new book on the lost continent of Mu. So I asked the question, should we understand what he wrote? And I think the answer to that is yes. It's very relevant because you have people that are making things up that can get people in big trouble. And we don't need that. And I want to make sure that James isn't responsible for it. So another thing is that James gave us a recognition of our shared human existence, that we were all born in the same place, that we're all from the same place, and that eventually, through understanding, we can come back to where we are, one people. So there's the natural disasters and things are the only thing that provide suffering to people, as opposed to hatred and bigotry.